What I'd like to do is just start off by suggesting that gambling today has become normalized in our society, and we have an increased availability in terms of venues and types of gambling. Sports wagering is rapidly moving through the United States as well as Canada and around the world. There's increased accessibility. There are more states and more venues that are easily accessible. More states have either online gambling or land-based gambling. There's increased social acceptability. It's no longer viewed as sin and vice in most jurisdictions. It's typically viewed as a socially acceptable recreational pastime. There's a continued lack of awareness around youth gambling problems, and there's concern over the growing number of states, as I mentioned previously, looking at online sports wagering. The numbers of people participating, the amounts of money being wagered on sports in the United States are actually astronomical. There's a few for people, I talked about this before in North Carolina, but I just want to show that gambling can be viewed on a continuum, and what we're really who are at risk for gambling problems or who are showing gambling problems. And we've changed our terminology over the years. But when we try to assess gambling problems, well, I kind of view this as a measurement challenge field. Firstly, there's a lack of consensus about what is the definition of a problem gambler or a disordered gambler. And there are other issues, as you could see, in terms of the nomenclature that's been changing over time. We now have in the DSM-5, it's now referred to as disordered gambling, or as well as in the ICD. And severe end gambling by youth may be a component of adolescent problem behavior syndrome, rather as a primary disorder. And I'm going to come back to that later on because that's important when we look at this in terms of a public health framework and also a mental health framework. The instrumentation we've typically been using to assess problem gambling or disordered gambling or compulsive gambling amongst youth are basically limited to screening tools. And the problem is that some studies have been really too small, have too small a sample to accurately measure a low base rate problem gambling. And we'll talk about that in a second. There are differences in prevalence rates. So when you read journal articles or read book chapters about problem gambling, I'm going to refer to this as problem gambling as opposed to disordered gambling or compulsive gambling. But basically the reasons for those differences tend to be how one samples problem gambling, whether you're using a telephone survey, online survey, school-based survey, which screen you're going to use. I'm going to talk about the screens that we're using for gambling problems. I'm not going to talk, I know you're going to have a webinar on gaming screens, of which most of those gaming screens have been adapted from gambling screens. The other issues are whether we use a community sample or a convenience sample. If we go into schools, which is typically what we tend to do because it's pretty convenient, and we have a group of individuals who are there in a captive audience. Different instruments and different measurements give different prevalence rates. They often will be varied by the cutoff points that are used. So some instruments that may require 4 endorsements in certain jurisdictions may be viewed as 2 or 3. We have different measures which have been modified. Not all prevalence studies use the standardized measures that have been developed. or been actually replicated over time for validity and reliability. And there's a lack of consistency across studies. So whether or not you have different availability or accessibility, not every state has accessibility even to a lottery. Whether or not the age restrictions will actually vary, whether gender distributions have been taken into account. So if you go into a school, for example, and 65% of your population are females, and you don't account for that, you will get a distorted distribution for prevalence rates. We know there are also cultural variables that are taken into account, and accessibility to legal and illegal forms of gambling. And as more and more states develop online gambling, this is becoming a huge issue. However, there are some things that we know, that there is a considerable consensus that gambling and wagering amongst young people is quite common and popular. And the large-scale studies and the meta-analyses of these studies have concluded that youth constitute a high-risk population for gambling problems. In fact, any of the studies that I've either conducted or read show that young people are significantly more likely to exhibit gambling problems. But they exhibit gambling problems in different ways. And some of you may be familiar with Gamblers Anonymous. When we send teenagers to Gamblers Anonymous, the kids all come back and say, I'm not like those people. I haven't lost a family member. I haven't been divorced. I haven't lost my home. I still live with my parents. So they view things in a very different way. But even the National Research Council report to then President Clinton showed that the proportion of pathological gambling amongst adolescents in the US can be more than 3 times that of adults. And in fact, if you look at prevalence rates, and Rachel Volberg has done an enormous number of studies looking at prevalence rates of adults as well as adolescents. But if you look at the adult prevalence rates from those individuals 18 plus, it's the 18 to 25-year-olds that have the highest prevalence of gambling problems amongst all adults. The other thing I want to mention is that pathological or disordered gambling or problem gambling is now being viewed as a behavioral addiction. So in the new DSM-5, it's designated as a behavioral addiction. And our screening scales have not really kept up with our conceptualization of gambling disorders. Differences between diagnostic criteria established originally in DSM-3 right through DSM-5 clearly denote changes in conceptualization of adult pathological gambling. There is no special designation for youth pathological gambling. And debates about the appropriate criteria and concerns for validity and reliability have prompted research designed to address some of these questions. And so, for example, and I'm going to talk about this, the KG, which is a Canadian developed instrument to assess problem gambling, was really designed specifically for adults. And we've discussed this in terms of the Second International Think Tank on Youth Gambling Issues. Qualities exist within all the instruments that we use to assess problem or disorder gambling. So we have behavioral indicators of problem playing. We have emotional and psychological correlates associated with problem playing. We have adverse consequences of excessive playing, and economic and sociological aspects. So all the scales tend to have some questions or some identifying characteristics around all of these different areas. You will note that in and this is true for adults as well in terms of adult gambling screens, even for the DSM-5, that there's no indication of the amount of money that one loses while gambling, or the amount of money one wagers while gambling. And the reason for that is it's highly variable. People have all kinds of different levels of their socioeconomic level, as well as their disposable income, as well as their revenues. There's considerable concern and interest amongst researchers, clinicians, and policymakers to look at some uniformity in nomenclature and the development of what we often refer to as a gold standard, a standardized instrument that would be acceptable as the instrument to be used in psychiatric, psychological, and sociological gambling research and treatment. Right now, we don't have that. So depending upon the jurisdiction that one goes to, you will actually find different instruments being used. And I'm going to highlight some of the major instruments being used for adolescents. And it probably is wise for us to really look at developing a screening inventory that can be used both as for screening as well as a diagnostic instrument for looking at different scoring criteria. Here's what we know from the DSM-5 with respect to adult gambling disorders, though. And I put this in red: the problem gambling behavior leads to clinically significant impairment or distress. And that's critical. People like Charles Barkley, the famous basketball player, or Michael Jordan, again, another famous basketball player, who have millions and millions of dollars, who are huge gamblers, who by diagnostic criteria would fall in the category of being a problem, will tell you they don't have any problems because they can afford to lose, whether they're spending time with their families or whether they're lying to people about the level of their gambling is a different issue. But if you look at the criteria for the DSM-5, one of the things that you see is the need to gamble with increasing amounts of money in order to achieve that desired level of excitement. People habituate, and so the only way to keep that going is to gamble more frequently and to gamble for higher amounts of money. Whether or not the individual is restless or irritable when attempting to cut down or stop their gambling, and that the individual has made repeated unsuccessful efforts to control, cut back, or stop gambling. The individual is often preoccupied with one's gambling, and this becomes a significant factor. The individual often gambles when feeling distressed, helpless, guilty, anxious, or depressed, and they will gamble as a way of trying to relieve that anxiety or depression. And will they return again another day to get even? And this is what we refer to as chasing one. We know that problem gamblers also frequently lie to family members, therapists, or others to conceal the extent of involvement with their gambling. And they've jeopardized or lost a significant relationship, job, or educational or career opportunity because of gambling. And they rely on others to help provide money in order for them to relieve a desperate financial situation or to enable them to gamble. And we also know from the DSM-5 that the gambling is not better explained by a manic episode, but rather it's a repeated effort that goes along. Now, I refer to these DSM-5 criteria because for adults, because the scales that have been developed, the screening instruments that have been developed, have really been markedly developed based upon these same diagnostic criteria. So if we look at a clinical description of pathological or problem or disorder gambling, it's a continuous involvement in and preoccupation with gambling and an inability to stop, despite resulting in adverse consequences. Typically, when we see individuals, young people who have gambling problems, we never see them when they've won a lot of money. We typically see them when there are a whole host of these adverse consequences. It may rely on difficulties in completing schoolwork or in terms of getting along with parents or other members of their family because they've lost a lot of money or they've lied to their family members. The literature is fairly consistent, and you may say this is not so consistent if it's between 2.5% and 8% of adolescents endorse a handful of signs or symptoms that reflect over-involvement, preoccupation, and narrowing of a behavioral repertoire with respect to the gambling. But earlier I explained why there's this variation between jurisdictions in this number. In our research recently in Wood County, Ohio, where we do a study every 2 years, we're now collecting data. It revealed that 2.7% of adolescents were disorder gamblers, and that was a slight decrease from 3% in the previous study that was done in 2018. Using something called the Adhd clip, and I'm going to talk about the gambling screens as well in a few minutes. So this is a list of the commonly used instruments for identifying problem gambling in adolescents. We have the SOGS-RA, which is based upon the SOGS instrument developed by Henry Lasser for adults. We have the DSM-4J or the DSM-4-MRJ that was developed by Sue Fisher, which it was based on the DSM-4. We have the MAGS, which came out of Harvard, the GA-20, which is sometimes used, which the Gamblers Anonymous questions. We have the KG, and this is the one that was developed exclusively or primarily for adolescents by a group headed by Richard Tremblay and Stinchfield, Weeb, and Harold Wynn as well. And then we have the Adhd clip, and I'm going to show you that as well. That was developed in 2009, which is a derivation of the Adhd for adults. And each instrument is reported to have its advantages and disadvantages with considerable overlap between the measures. And I'll tell you which ones are my preference and what some of the reasons are, actually. So the SOGS-RA, which was a research instrument for adolescents, was developed to more accurately assess adolescent gambling. It's a 16-item scale, and you can get copies of this online. The first 4 items are omitted for scoring, and those really ask individuals about the frequency in which they're gambling and the types of activities they're gambling on. This would have to be updated because when this was developed in 1992, in the United States, there was no legalized online gambling, nor was there sports wagering. And the items from the original SOGS developed by Henry Lasser were reworded to make them more age appropriate and scoring then adjusted. It emphasized the frequency of gambling behavior and behavioral indices, often accompanied by problem gambling, in contrast to heavy emphasis on money spent gambling. In another study done by Ken Winters and his colleagues on this instrument, they found satisfactory reliability and validity measures, as well as discriminating between regular and non-regular gamblers. However, there have been some studies that have basically suggested that they haven't been adequately with adolescent female, given the low rate of female problem gamblings in the original sample. As we know, more males have gambling problems than females. More males gamble more than females, and more males tend to show symptoms of gambling problems than females. I guess that's the good news. The bad news is that females are actually catching up, and we also see this amongst adolescent females. If you look at the GA20, the Gamblers Anonymous 20 questions, this was a widely utilized screen for pathological gambling. It's also been used for adolescents. It's based upon difficulties experienced by GA members, those who attend Gamblers Anonymous meetings. It was designed to help problem gamblers self-diagnose themselves and decide whether or not they required help or should be attending GA meetings. And the 20 items identify particular situations and behaviors typical of pathological or problem gamblers. The questions address the financial correlates of continued gambling, the personal consequence of excessive gambling, the social correlates, how it impacts their family members, and if the individuals endorse 7 of the 20 items, it's considered to be a person who has pathological or compulsive gambling. And you can see the terminology in the 1970s looked at pathological or compulsive gambling, with many of the state affiliates still having pathological or compulsive gambling in their titles. That's now changed to problematic gambling or disorder gambling. It remains interesting as a scale because it was developed by compulsive gamblers who were personally afflicted by the addiction. And it was designed to assess problem gambling, giving it immediate face validity for a particular profile of gamblers. However, some items that constitute the screen are very different from the diagnostic criteria outlined in the more recent DSM-4 and the DSM-5. DSM-5 is very similar to the DSM-4, except they've taken out the question that looks at stealing in order to support their gambling problem. We've done some studies and published some papers that suggest that it's actually probably better to keep those items in, or that particular item in some of the recent scales. So based on the DSM-4, Sue Fisher in the early 1990s and later on in 2000 developed a DSM-4J for DSM-4J being for juveniles, or modified responses for juveniles in 2000. This consists of 12 items or 9 categories, and the responses are given in a yes/no format. The new scale, the DSM-4-MRJ, enables differential scoring depending upon multiple responses for an item. But it's very closely modeled on the adult version, except they've changed some things to include things like where individuals acquire their money from. Money can be allocated from school lunches and bus transportation. Committing crimes includes specifying theft from homes, outside the family, and shoplifting, rather than the adult examples in the DSM-4 of forgery, fraud, and embezzlement. We know that young people are often trying to get money in order to continue to support their gambling problems. The DSM-4J comprises 9 dimensions in pathological gambling. There's progression and preoccupation. There's tolerance, There's withdrawal and loss of control, escape, chasing, lies, and deceptions, looking at illegal acts, family and academic disruptions, and financial bailouts by family members. And Sue Fisher, in her research that was originally done in the UK, but replicated in many other jurisdictions, including work that we've done in the US and Canada, suggests that meeting 4 of the 12 criteria was sufficient to classify individuals as probable pathological gamblers. Because it was a screening instrument and not necessarily a diagnostic instrument, or could be used as a diagnostic instrument, we tended to call these people probable pathological gamblers. And if you read a lot of our early research, you will see that we refer to these people as probable pathological gamblers. The other screen that's been used, developed by Howard Schaefer and the people at Harvard, is the MAGS. And that was developed to assess the prevalence of pathological gambling amongst the general population of adolescents. It's a brief clinical screening instrument, and it incorporates many of the DSM-4 criteria for pathological gambling into a set of survey questions. And the MAGS, in conjunction with the DSM-4 criteria, is a 26-item scale, includes 2 subscales designed to provide clinicians and researchers with a method of identifying individuals' gambling difficulties. The validity and discriminant analysis were effective in predicting problem gambling, and they use measures of biological, psychological, and social problems amongst youth with excessive gambling problems. And the authors concluded that the MAGS seemed to be a valid, efficient, clinically useful, and a quick screen that can be used to identify individuals who are at risk of problem gambling. This little table that I've created just basically shows you the levels of the types of gambling that are involved and where the commonalities actually lie between some of these different scales. You see that chasing behavior is an important area, lying and stealing. The 2 probably most commonly used instruments right now are the DSM-4 MRJ, and the SOGS-RA is still widely used. Okay, so I want just briefly, the KG was the Canadian Adolescent Gambling Inventory that we developed, or was developed in Canada. We were consultants on that project. This one started off from scratch. It started off by looking at adolescent behavior and then tried to incorporate gambling problems. It was developed in 2010. It's been used in a number of studies, not overly widely used internationally. It was developed to look at the prevalence of problem pathological gambling amongst the general population, not a specific population, whether they be individuals in youth detention centers. And it looks at past 3 months gambling behavior, whereas many of the other scales look at past 12 months. They use a traffic light metaphor with 45 items. So you could be in the green range, you could be in the yellow or caution range, and red traffic light metaphor is that individuals who are experiencing significant gambling problems. They look at different consequences of gambling. As you could see here, they're looking at psychological consequences, social, financial, loss of control, problem gambling severity. So one of the screening instruments that is often used is something called the NODS clip. We've used this repeatedly in a large number of studies. And this was developed from the original NODS 17-item measure, which looked at the 10-item DSM-4 And it's a 3-item quick screen. And jurisdictions that look at multiple adolescent problem behaviors or risky behaviors often like to use this because it's only 3 questions. And the 3 questions are the following. Have there ever been periods less than 2 weeks or longer when you spent a lot of time thinking about your gambling or planning out future gambling ventures? Have you ever tried to stop, cut down, or control your gambling? Or have you ever lied to family members, friends, or others about how much you gamble or how much money you lost on gambling? If you identify any one of these 3, you may be individuals may be experiencing a gambling problem. There's serious concerns remain as to whether or not studies reporting prevalence data use different measures are actually comparable. I basically showed you what some of the results are from our comparison studies. But I want to identify another particular problem. Here you could see some of the behaviors that we have identified over time, and that if you look at a comparison in one of the studies, we gave youth all 3 instruments. We randomized the instruments, and the DSM-4J, this was before the MRJ was available, actually showed 3.4% of the population overall, or 4.7% of gamblers, because not everyone in the adolescent population are gamblers. If you use the same instrument on those people, you find 5.3% of the population showed up as problem gambling, 7.4% of gamblers, and the GA identified the largest number of problem gamblers in the population, 6%. So basically, all this really means is that depending upon the instrument you use, you may get different general prevalence rates. If you're using it as a screening tool and then following it up with more diagnostic information, acceptable. One of the reasons why we like using the DSM-4 MRJ is it's the one that has the least population overall, and so we're able to better identify some of the traits. Males, as previously mentioned, continue to be engaging in gambling activities to a much larger degree than females. When you look at sports wagering, that's also particularly true. With respect to online wagering, it depends on what kind of activity you're looking at. Female adolescents also tend to like to gamble more on simulated forms of slot machines or VLT machines. Males tend to be much more interested in action type games, whether it be poker or blackjack. What we know is the intercorrelation between all the instruments was still fairly high. Males were significantly higher than females, again, because more males were gambling. We had a much larger population. The false positive and false negative rates remain relatively low. Just to give you a more comprehensive picture of what's going on, you could see the numbers as one goes along in terms of a new sample that we used, and the males tend to be more pathological gamblers. If you look at the SOGS-RA, it's about 11%. If you look at the GA20, it's about 10%. And as I mentioned earlier, not only will there be a video of this webinar available to you, but all these slides will also be available. So here's one of the problems with all the scales. Each item on the scales is counted equally. And we know that the consequences and the behaviors associated with problem gambling are not. But I want to show you from the DSM-4 what the endorsement rates are for problem gamblers by question, because this will show you how problem gamblers endorse certain activities. And so basically, you find yourself thinking about gambling activities. Almost 82% of problem gamblers, and we're talking adolescents now, endorse that particular item. Lying, 79%. After spending money on gambling, chasing behaviors, 74%. In the past year, have you spent school money or money for bus fares or other forms of money on gambling that they've gotten? 68%. Have you taken from someone money, someone you live with, or stealing money? And most adolescents who take money start by doing it in their homes, primarily because the belief is if they get caught, their parents are not going to turn them over to the police or to some agency. 58% of people, and that's one of the reasons why we think it's important to keep the stealing money in there. But we'll also look at this. 50% of all adolescents report gambling as a way of escaping their problems. You need to spend more and more money, and this relates to the habituation and need for escalation. Have you stolen money from outside the family? Relatively small percent, although almost 30% of people are telling us, adolescents are telling us they're doing it. Do you become restless, tense, bad-tempered when trying to cut down? 26%. Have you gone to someone for help with a serious money issue? 21%. Have you fallen out with a family member or close friend because of gambling? Almost 11%. And have you missed school to participate in gambling experiences? Only about 8% of problem gamblers actually tell us they're doing that. So the question then becomes, what about all these adolescents? I may have mentioned this story before in one of the other workshops I did in North Carolina, but one night I was asked to give a presentation to be on a panel to parents of adolescents. And on that panel was myself, who focused on gambling. There was someone who focused on cigarette smoking, someone who focused on drug use, someone who focused on alcohol use. And after the session, after all our presentations were over, you kind of get the feeling, are we not talking about the same individual? Or are they problem gamblers very unique? Are adolescents who have alcohol problems very unique? Are individuals who are experiencing drug problems very unique? So the question then becomes, is youth problem gambling a primary disorder? Because we know that individuals' gambling problems, problem gambling, also touch a wide variety of other behaviors here. So in order to address this issue, I want to show you what we've been doing in Ohio, in Wood County, Ohio. And we've been doing this with people there for quite a few number of years. This is a biennial survey that's done since 2006. And the result I'm going to show you is the 2020 results, which were based upon 6,744 adolescents. So if you just look at their gambling behavior here for a second, it's broken down by males, and it's also broken down by grade level. What you could see is that there doesn't seem to be all that much difference in terms of problem gambling amongst individuals who are either younger or older. But what you could see here is that males tend to have higher rates of problem gambling. They also tend, in this sample, to also have higher rates of gambling in general. Sometimes we call these people social, occasional, recreational gamblers. Males tend to be more involved in that behavior. just to give you a little bit of comparison as to what kinds of gambling activities they're engaged in, what you can see is that the kind of blue-gray is in 2016, with the grayish bars here being the most recent behavior. And what you could see is that they're actively involved in a wide variety of gambling events, sports wagering. Again, it's important to note that this was before legalization of sports wagering in most jurisdictions, including Ohio. Lottery playing, scratch lotteries tend to be very, very popular amongst individuals, adolescents, and they will tell you it's the easiest to engage in. We also looked at fantasy sports, which was fairly consistent across the years. Daily fantasy, we didn't see all that much change. And then we started to look at esports in 2020, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in the new sample in 2022, because esports look at gambling based on video game playing. So individuals will be betting on teams of gamers, sophisticated gamers, and we know that many of the land-based casinos are now starting to actively look at playing esports or accepting esports wagers. If you look at only the 12th grade males, the oldest in the cohort, what you find is they're to gamble on more things and tend to be involved in more fantasy sports, slightly more sports wagering, more card games, a little less fantasy sports, and a little less esports, but still previous numbers that we've reported for esports wagering. I'm not going to have time to really go through this carefully, but once again, you will have these numbers for you in the presentation. But you can actually see here how often people bet on various forms of activities, those in youth between the ages of 12 to 18. That doesn't mean that's where gambling actually starts. In fact, we found that in a large number of our studies, that young people 9 and 10 are actually starting to gamble for money. Now, to get back to the question as whether or not gambling problems are the primary disorder, I want to show you that if you look at the gambling severity going from non-gambling, social, occasional, recreational gambling to problem gambling, really a linear trend, independent of the kind of questions that we're actually asking. So, living with someone with mental health issues, you see again, problem gamblers score the highest. Living with someone who has a problem with drinking alcohol, 26%. Again, linear increase. So they're exposed to a lot of people who are mental health disorders as well. And then once again, I'm not going to go through each of these, but you will see that many of them experienced or felt neglect. We've published a number of studies which have looked at verbal abuse amongst problem gamblers, adolescent problem gamblers, sexual abuse, neglect, and emotional abuse. We also know that suicide ideation increases with gambling severity, and we know that gambling problems or individuals with gambling problems much more likely to talk about suicide ideation or thinking about suicide. And a number of people have looked at suicide attempts as well. So youth with mental health disorders, and this is a screen that we use in the Woods County study. It's a special screen. And you can actually see no problems. And this is a linear track based upon when we did this survey. No mental health problems seem to be going down in 2020 from several years previously. Low problems also seems to be fairly consistent. Matter of problems also seems to be on a slight rise, but look at those with severe or intense problems. Overall, what we see is in 2018, 7.8% of individuals were reporting severe and intense mental health problems. In 2020, this was 9.7%. But if you look at those with gambling problems, we actually see higher numbers. So basically, the general conclusion from this is that youth with gambling problems also have a number of mental health issues. And here you could see we've broken it down a little more carefully by non-gamblers, social, occupational, occasional, recreational gamblers, and problem gamblers. You can actually see those with severe symptoms, mental health symptoms based upon their gambling severity scores tend to increase in a linear way. Those with intense symptoms similarly do that. Low symptoms, fewer. No symptoms, even fewer amongst the problem gamblers. Although a third of problem gamblers tend to have no other or seem to report no other mental health issues. If you want to look at this for substance use, you could see it based on smoking cigarettes, cannabis use, alcohol, marijuana. Once again, look at the linear increase going up. We published a number of studies looking at vaping as well, but look at the alcohol use tends to be significantly increased as a result of problem gambling, or problem gambling is significantly increased as a result of alcohol use. Binge drinking also increases in a linear fashion. Marijuana use increases, and so does stimulant use as one goes in terms of gambling severity. If you look at bullying behavior, those individuals who were bullied, physical abuse amongst problem gamblers tends to be the highest. Verbal abuse tends to be the highest. Cyber or internet abuse also tends to be the highest. All individuals, and indirect abuse by family members also tends to be the highest. So if you look at this column here, between a quarter and almost a third of individuals with gambling problems or exhibiting disorder gambling tend to have been bullied or are experiencing significant abuse. One of the other things that we've looked at, and we did a number of webinars, looking at the migration between gaming and gambling. So we looked at the impact of playing games or gaming excessively on gambling. And what you see is that 46% of, or almost 47% of non-gamblers play only play more than 2 hours a day. This is not significantly related to problem gambling, but if you look at the daily use of gaming, of playing more than 2 hours or 2 hours or more a day, what you find is, again, a linear increase. So as you go gambling severity from a non-gambler to a social occasional gambler to problem gambler in terms of the gambling screens, what we find people. And that becomes really concerning because of the similarities between gaming and gambling, purchasing loot boxes on games, as well as the ability to look at gaming. So the general findings that we have are about 30% of youth are gambling for money. 22% could be identified as social, recreational, occasional gamblers, and about 7%, but again, a disproportionately higher percentage of males than females in some form of gambling-related problems. And adolescents remain a relatively high risk for a wide variety of mental health problems, 15.8% showing moderate problems, and 9.7% showing intense problems, and 7.8%. My best guess is when we look at the 2022 data, we're actually going to see a higher percentage of adolescents overall who've experienced mental health problems as a result of lockdowns and COVID and related to COVID. Problem gamblers report more severe or intense mental health symptoms compared to social occasional gamblers and non-gamblers. As gambling severity and problems increase, non-gambling all the way to problem gambling, we see a linear increase for individuals who are living with someone with a mental health issue, typically maybe grandparents, living with someone with a drinking problem, living with someone who's been incarcerated, increased domestic violence or abuse, increased suicide ideation, increased reported suicide attempts, and increased smoking, as well as stimulant use and marijuana use. So overall, the general conclusion, when you're treating problem gamblers, it's also important not only to look at their performance on a gambling screen, but one also has to look at their mental health capabilities and problems that they're experiencing. So in our clinic, one of the things that we always assess for are other mental health problems, because it may be one thing to get rid of the problem gambling, but if the individual is still experiencing other mental health perspectives, the chance of remission is quite high. So I want to stop there, give people a chance for a few minutes at least for questions. I want your attention and participation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Derevinsky, for a very thorough presentation. And as people are thinking of their questions, I am currently reading a lot about ADHD and gaming. Can you talk to me a little bit about ADHD and gambling? And if we find that there are individuals that are experiencing ADHD that also have those gambling issues because of the ADHD symptoms?
Yeah, gambling was originally categorized as an impulse control disorder.
Well, I think we accidentally lost him. Maybe he'll come back on here to answer that question. As we're waiting for him to come back on, is there anybody else that has any questions? And if he is not able to reconnect, I can, of course, send everyone. Oh, there we go. He's back. Dr. Derevinsky, I think we lost you there.
I'm back.
We missed the answer to that question.
In the internet. But gambling was originally categorized as an impulse control disorder. Studies that have shown that young disorders have more gambling problems than those individuals who are not ADHD.
Thank you for that information. Are there any other questions? Looks like I'm seeing some great comments. Everyone's thanking you for being here. Let me see if we got a question here. Oh, getting credit and a certificate for this training, you will need to fill out the UNC Behavioral Health Springboard survey. And once you fill out that survey, you will have a certificate emailed to you. Any other questions for Dr. Derevinsky? The slides, Dr. Derevinsky, you plan on emailing those to us to be, I know that UNC BHS already has those, so I'm sure they'll probably email those out.
Yeah, I've sent those previously.
Yes, and I think Maria put that link in the chat box. So thank you, Maria, for doing that. Terrific. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you for being with us today. We really appreciate all of your knowledge, and thank you for being a leader in this field. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much, Allison, for your kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be with people in North Carolina. It'd be better if I was actually there, but at least we could communicate online. And I wish you all well. And you don't have to keep the questions just for this presentation, but if you have any other questions on gambling or problem gaming, feel free to email me, and I'm more than happy to try to answer those.
Thank you. And to answer another question about getting to the Behavioral Health Springboard website, that's where you registered for this training. So it's University of North Carolina Behavioral Health Springboard is where you go and you'll use your login to be able to access the materials for this training. And you should also have this, I believe, the link to the survey emailed out. Is that correct, Robbie?
Yeah, I think so. Well, if you go to the website, all the slides are there, and I believe there should be, or there will be, the recorded version of this as well. That you just go to the UNC Behavioral Health Springboard website, and it's all there.
Yeah, including the link to the survey that they fill out, or is that emailed out? I think that's.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think that's part of the link of getting your CE certificate.
Okay. Terrific.
I believe. And if it's not, you guys shoot me an email, but I believe so. Yes.
So the certificate will be emailed out and the link to the survey will be in that.
Yes, it's incorporated one way or the other, the evaluations with the certificates. Yep.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks again, everyone. And everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Dr. Derevinsky. Great stuff. Thank you.
Yes.
All right.
Stay healthy, everyone.
Yes. Stay warm.
Yeah.
Doctor, try. Hope to talk soon.
I can relate to that.
Yes.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks
See
for
you.
the invite.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Hey, Allison, did you want to, I mean, we could do this offline. The polling question.
Well, on my end right now, all I see is, I don't see where I can launch polls on my end currently, but if, give me those capabilities for tomorrow though, right?
Yeah, I think you do as a host. So if you move, there should be on the bottom or the top, like the ribbon there, the black ribbon that has your mute video. There's polls.
Yeah, and for some reason it's not showing up.
You don't see it? Okay.
No, I'll show you what it's across the bottom. We have participants, question and A, chat, share screen, raise hand, and the more, oh here, I recorded it too.